In the midst of the chaos and horrors of World War II, where devastation seemed endless and the human spirit often seemed broken, there emerged an unexpected moment of tenderness, a moment wrapped in contradiction. Japanese women, soldiers and civilians alike, were taken as prisoners of war by American forces. They had heard stories of the brutality that awaited them: cramped, unsanitary conditions, the harsh glare of foreign captors, and a life filled with scarcity and suffering. The thought of what might await them as prisoners was far worse than anything they had known. But in a dark, cold barracks one fateful day, something extraordinary happened. They were given a food they had never seen before, a dish that seemed more like a dream than reality: a slice of apple pie. Their eyes, already accustomed to war and famine, regarded the dish with skepticism. Was it poisoned? A joke, perhaps? Or was it simply a cruel reminder of what they could no longer have? But as they hesitated and finally took the first bite, the sweetness that flooded their senses was nothing short of astonishing. The flavor was unlike anything they had ever tasted. A fleeting, bittersweet moment of comfort. For the first time in months, something about their captivity felt strangely human. This simple dessert, a symbol of foreignness and sweetness, stood as an unexpected challenge to everything they had believed about their captors. How could something as simple as apple pie challenge the worldview they had spent so long constructing? The apple pie was not just a treat. It was the beginning of a transformation that would unravel the very core of their beliefs about the enemy, about war, and about humanity. The year is 1942. The world is embroiled in a global conflict unlike any other. The Pacific War, a theater of World War II, had engulfed nations and families alike. On one side, the Empire of Japan, with its militaristic ambition and an expansionist agenda, stretched its grip across Asia and the Pacific. On the other, the United States, alongside its allied forces, fought to push back this ever-expanding imperial power. The stakes were high, and the cost of the war was measured not just in the lives lost, but in the lives disrupted, displaced, and forever changed. Japan's imperial ideology was grounded in the belief of its superiority, often casting its enemy, especially the United States, as barbaric and distant. The concept of war as a national duty permeated the culture, especially for women who were expected to contribute to the war effort, whether through working in munitions factories, caring for wounded soldiers, or supporting their nation's military endeavors. The women who found themselves captured by American forces were not simply civilians. They were shaped by the same militaristic ideology that had sent their male counterparts into battle. Yet, in the brutal aftermath of their capture, the reality of war shattered much of what they had been taught to believe about their captors. In 1942, after fierce battles such as the fall of the Philippines and the Battle of Wake Island, many women and children were taken as prisoners of war by the American forces. They had been part of the Japanese military's occupation forces or lived in occupied territories. The horrors of these first few months of captivity were not unlike those faced by their male counterparts: poor food, disease, overcrowded conditions, and psychological trauma. Yet these women, many of whom were young mothers, had been told that their captors were cruel and inhuman beneath consideration, just as Japan's propaganda had long depicted the enemy. The American forces, in their eyes, were invaders whose sole purpose was to degrade and humiliate their nation. The suffering they had been enduring was only magnified by the overwhelming tension of their internment. The very idea of being held, prisoner by an enemy that had once been demonized in propaganda, was enough to stir both fear and anger. These women had heard stories of the harshness of American POW camps, stories of starvation, disease, and physical abuse. They had been taught to believe that the Americans were brutish, their culture barbaric and materialistic. The idea of surrender, of being taken as prisoners, was unthinkable for many. Yet it was a reality they had been forced to face. In the cramped barracks of the POW camps, which were often little more than makeshift structures hastily erected to house the women, the tension was palpable. The prisoners lived in overcrowded conditions, separated from their families and forced to work for their captors. These women, once warriors in their own right, were now caught in the gears of an unrelenting war machine, stripped of their dignity, their autonomy, and, at times, their will to fight. The food provided in the camps was a cruel reminder of their new reality. Dried rations, boiled rice, thin soups, and whatever meager offerings their captors could spare. The tastes were harsh, unfamiliar, and unsatisfying, often leaving the prisoners feeling empty, both physically and emotionally. The psychological toll was immense. For many of the women, the constant refrain of humiliation and defeat echoed in their minds. It was within this stark reality, in a moment of unexpected vulnerability, that the apple pie appeared. It was not a product of the harsh environment. It was a gift, or perhaps an experiment, from the American captors, who, while strict and unyielding in their enforcement of the rules, also seemed to possess an unexpected kindness that would unsettle many of the prisoners. The juxtaposition of the pie, with its warm, comforting sweetness, against the backdrop of the suffering and harshness of the camp, was jarring. How could this food, so foreign and full of richness, exist in a place so stripped of comfort? The confusion was palpable. What did this gesture mean? Could their captors, the very men they had been taught to hate, have a sense of empathy? Was this an act of mockery, or something more? The apple pie offered an answer to that question. It was not just food. It was an invitation to reconsider the worldview that had been shaped by decades of wartime propaganda. It was a moment that would forever change the perspective of the women who tasted it, forcing them to confront a reality they had never anticipated. But what did it really mean? How could something so simple as food, a treat that was so alien to their war-torn lives, create such a profound shift? The apple pie wasn't just about food. It was about the dissonance between the enemy they had imagined and the reality they now faced. And it would be the first of many contradictions that would unfold during their time as prisoners of war. The journey from warrior to prisoner was abrupt, jarring, and filled with deep personal anguish for many of the Japanese women who found themselves on the wrong side of the war. The capture of these women was not merely a byproduct of military defeat, it was a consequence of the larger, ever-changing tides of war. They had been living in the shadow of a powerful, expanding empire, one that seemed invincible and unstoppable. These women had once been part of that mighty machine, contributing to the war effort with all their strength and loyalty. They were nurses, factory workers, and in some cases, even combatants who had been conscripted into the war in various roles. But no amount of patriotism or duty could shield them from the fate that awaited them when their military positions were overrun. As Japan's military forces lost key strongholds throughout the Pacific, the tide of war began to turn. The Battle of Midway in 1942 was a significant turning point. With American forces gaining ground, many Japanese strongholds, including islands in the Pacific and territories like the Philippines, fell one after another. In the chaos of retreat and surrender, hundreds of women were captured and interned in POW camps. Some of them were forced to leave their homes and families behind, caught in the crossfire of a war they did not want to fight. For these women, their lives were abruptly taken from them. In the camps, there was little distinction between those who had been captured through military engagement and those who had been swept up in the tide of war. It did not matter that many of the women had been civilians or non-combatants. They were all prisoners now, and their captors, Americans, represented everything they had been taught to fear and despise. American propaganda, with its portrayal of the United States as a land of decadence and cruelty, painted a picture of the enemy as barbaric, ruthless, and without honor. For these women, their American captors were not human beings, but faceless monsters driven by a desire to destroy their culture and way of life. The captives were subjected to degrading treatment upon arrival in the camps. They were placed in crowded barracks, where sanitation was poor and privacy was non-existent. The environment was harsh, and every day was an exercise in endurance. Rations were scarce, and any small comforts that the women had once known were now completely out of reach. The barracks were cold, the air stale, and the constant presence of guards, who were often stern and unrelenting, only served to reinforce the sense of captivity. Their expectations of life as POWs were rooted in fear, despair, and the belief that this was to be their punishment. From what they had been told, the Americans would treat them with disdain, as inferior beings. Stories of mistreatment, of brutal discipline, and of forced labor circulated among the prisoners. Many expected nothing but cold, heartless treatment from their captors. They had been taught to believe that Americans were no better than savages, driven by greed and a lust for power. They were mentally prepared for hardship, physically weak, emotionally drained, and mentally beaten down by the loss of their homeland's honor. Their dreams of home, of family, and of Japan's eventual victory seemed distant and unreachable. Yet, they held on to the belief that they would survive. After all, they were not only prisoners, they were warriors, and warriors never surrendered completely. In the silence of the barracks, they clung to the hope that somehow Japan would win, and they would return home to rebuild their lives. But amidst the bleakness of their new existence, there was also a sense of uncertainty. The Japanese women who found themselves in these camps were far from the front lines of the battle. They were far removed from the decisions of generals and diplomats. Their lives had been torn apart by a war that was not of their making. They were not the ones who had declared war on the United States. They were not the ones responsible for the suffering of the world, and yet they were caught in the vice of international conflict. They did not know what would come next, nor could they imagine the shape of their future. Amid the hopelessness, the American guards, those faceless, dreaded figures, seemed even more threatening. The guards, for the most part, adhered to military discipline, but there was a strange air of detachment about them. Some were stern, but others showed a surprising degree of restraint. At times, there were moments of kindness, as when the women were offered food that seemed more like a gift than a necessity. But these small gestures felt like anomalies, out of place in the broader context of their suffering. As the women huddled in the barracks, their minds fixed on survival, their views of their captors remained fixed in the mold of propaganda. Americans were monsters, and there was no reason to think otherwise. For many of them, this was a daily battle, not just for food and comfort, but for maintaining the belief that there was something worth fighting for. To accept that the reality of their captors might not be as bleak as they had imagined would be to unravel everything they had been taught, everything they had believed in. And yet, this assumption would soon be challenged in a way no one could have anticipated. The pie was not just food. It was a symbol of everything they thought they knew about their enemies. It was the first crack in the wall of propaganda, and its taste would set the stage for everything that was to follow. The first days in the POW camp were marked by disorientation and a sense of profound loss. These women, once proud and steadfast in their allegiance to Japan, now found themselves stripped of their dignity, their autonomy, and their identity. The harsh reality of captivity was a far cry from the expectations they had been prepared for. The world they had known, one that was driven by loyalty, honor, and national pride, seemed distant and irrelevant in the cold, barren barracks where they were now confined. The oppressive heat of the day mixed with the chill of the night, offering no reprieve from their suffering. Yet, in these early days, the women's expectations of brutality were shattered by moments of bewildering kindness. When the guards, some of whom had been stationed in Japan and had families of their own, offered basic comforts, like extra blankets or even a kind word, it left many of the women unsure of how to respond. They had been taught that the Americans were ruthless, cold-hearted, and unforgiving. The reality was more complicated. In the midst of this confusing new world, a strange offer arrived. Food, something they had not tasted for days, beyond the basic rice and watery soup. But this food, unlike anything they had ever seen, was sweet and comforting. It came in the form of apple pie, something so foreign to their experience that it almost seemed like a dream. They had been used to rice, pickled vegetables, and salted fish, the staple diet of a war-torn country. A pie, warm and filled with fruit, was not just a meal. It was a contradiction, an enigma wrapped in a flaky crust. It was not what they had been led to expect from their captors. For the women, this food was a shocking contrast to the conditions they had been enduring. At first they recoiled. The idea that such a treat could be offered by the very people they had been taught to despise was unthinkable. Was it a trick? A psychological tactic? They could not shake the suspicion that the Americans were attempting to break them down, to make them feel weak and humiliated. Yet, despite their wariness, hunger drove them to try the pie. They took small bites at first, unsure of how to react. But as the sweet, tangy flavor of apples and the rich, buttery crust touched their tongues, something shifted. A wave of surprise and disbelief washed over them. The pie, a humble dessert by American standards, was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was not just food. It was a symbol of something unexpected: kindness, empathy, and a warmth that contradicted the harsh, unforgiving image they had been taught to believe. Many of the women began to relax, if only slightly, as they savored the taste. The warm apple filling, combined with the golden crust, offered a fleeting comfort that momentarily eased the tension in their hearts. It was a tiny morsel of humanity amidst the suffering they endured. In the days that followed, some of the women found themselves reflecting on the contradiction they had just experienced. How could their enemies, the very people they had been taught to fear, show such kindness? It was confusing and, for many, deeply unsettling. These small moments of unexpected humanity made the world they now inhabited feel increasingly disorienting. The propaganda they had consumed all their lives had painted a very different picture of the American enemy. They had been told that the Americans were heartless, driven only by greed and the desire for domination. But now, with the taste of the pie lingering in their mouths, the enemy seemed human. This initial shock was not just a matter of food. It was about perception and identity. For many of the women, the question began to emerge: what did it mean to be an enemy? Could a people who gave them such a gift, something so simple yet so full of compassion, really be the monsters they had been led to believe? The pie, in its sweetness, was a catalyst for doubt, a quiet force that began to chip away at the walls of propaganda and hatred. In the days that followed, other surprises unfolded. The women began to notice subtle differences in the way they were treated. Some of the American guards, while stern and unwavering in their duties, were also careful to ensure that the prisoners were treated with a modicum of respect. They did not lash out in anger, nor did they use their power recklessly. Instead, some guards offered small acts of assistance, such as helping with medical care or sharing stories from home. These gestures, though simple, were enough to make the prisoners question everything they thought they knew about their captors. In one instance, a young woman named Aiko, who had been separated from her family, was allowed to write a letter to her mother. She had expected to be denied any communication, but when the American officer read her letter, he allowed it to be sent without comment. Aiko could hardly believe her eyes. In her mind, she had been prepared for cruelty, for indifference, and for silence. Yet, in the face of her despair, the simple act of communication seemed like a gift, a gesture of compassion that seemed almost too good to be true. Still, the overwhelming emotion that gripped the women in those early days was confusion. The apple pie had been the first taste of this bewildering new reality, but it was far from the last. For each small kindness, there was a part of them that remained on edge, that could not fully accept what was happening. Every gesture of humanity was questioned, as they struggled to reconcile this new image of their captors with the one they had carried with them for so long. The women were not the only ones grappling with these contradictions. The American soldiers themselves, who had grown accustomed to seeing the Japanese as faceless enemies, were starting to see these women as human beings too. Some were shocked by the prisoners' resilience and dignity, while others found themselves torn between duty and empathy. These early exchanges, though brief, set the stage for a transformation that none could have predicted. But amid this confusion, a question lingered. Could one simple act of kindness, one slice of apple pie, really challenge everything they had been taught to believe? And if so, what would that mean for the days ahead? How would this unexpected moment of sweetness change them, their perception of the enemy, and the course of their captivity? As the days turned into weeks, the women in the POW camp began to experience a growing sense of internal conflict. The contradictions they had encountered, the sweet surprise of the apple pie, the small gestures of kindness from their captors, did not fade. If anything, these moments intensified, challenging everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies. The shift in perception was gradual, like a crack forming in a tightly held belief, widening bit by bit until the walls began to crumble. The women began to notice more subtle shifts in their environment, some of which they could not easily dismiss. At first, they had been overwhelmed by the brutality of the situation, the overcrowded barracks, the daily exhaustion, the constant uncertainty. Yet, as time wore on, the barriers between prisoner and captor began to blur in ways they could not ignore. One day, an older woman named Keiko, whose family had been killed in the bombings of Japan, was suffering from a wound she had sustained during her capture. She had expected little more than neglect from the Americans. The thought of receiving medical care, much less compassionate care, seemed impossible. But, to her surprise, the American medic who tended to her wound was gentle and thorough, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. Keiko later confided in one of her fellow prisoners that she had been prepared to endure pain without sympathy, yet the kindness she had received from the medic left her feeling unsure about the narrative she had long held. Could it be that the Americans were not the monstrous figures she had envisioned? In another instance, a young prisoner named Haruko, who had been skeptical of any kindness shown by the Americans, had fallen ill with a fever. She had been living in the camp for weeks, struggling with a gnawing hunger and the overwhelming grief of losing her home and family. But when a female American guard saw her suffering and offered her a warm drink, Haruko's initial suspicion gave way to shock. She had expected to be treated with disdain or forced to endure in silence, but the offer of warmth and care was something she had never imagined from her captors. The guard, though firm in her duties, displayed a level of empathy that left Haruko both grateful and deeply conflicted. She had expected to hate the women who held her captive, but now she saw them through a different lens, one that she had not prepared for. These small but significant interactions began to unravel the foundation of the prisoners' beliefs. The women had been trained to view their captors through a singular lens, one shaped by years of wartime propaganda. The images of American soldiers as faceless, cruel enemies had been burned into their minds. Now, those images were being replaced by moments of humanity that were difficult to ignore. These contradictions were unsettling. How could the same people who had waged war on Japan and destroyed its cities show such kindness? It was as if the very concept of enemy was slipping through their fingers, leaving behind something more complex, something closer to shared humanity. In the midst of this disorienting realization, the women continued to struggle with their identity. Who were they now, if not the proud citizens of a mighty empire. How could they reconcile their role as prisoners with the memory of their once powerful nation? The emotional toll of captivity was immense, and the uncertainty of their future weighed heavily on them. They were caught between the world they had known, which was now shattered, and a new world that was confusing and filled with contradictions. The internal conflict grew as the women became more aware of the differences in the way their captors treated them. Some American soldiers were stern and distant, while others seemed almost protective. Some guards engaged with the women in conversation, sharing stories of their lives back home. These interactions, though rare, humanized the Americans in ways the prisoners had not thought possible. The women began to question their long-held beliefs. If the Americans could be kind, could they not also be capable of understanding and empathy? Could they not also be victims of the war, caught in a conflict they did not choose? The thought of these complexities began to chip away at the rigid perceptions the prisoners had long held. One evening, as the women sat together in the barracks, a small group of American soldiers arrived with more food: fresh bread, fruit, and once again, apple pie. This time, however, the pie was not a surprise. It was an offering, a gesture that spoke more of humanity than of military tactics. The women were grateful, but the gratitude was tempered by confusion. The pie had been a symbol of unexpected kindness the first time it had appeared, but now it had become a symbol of something else. A reminder that the lines between enemy and friend were not as clear as they had once seemed. This time, the prisoners ate in silence, each woman reflecting on how far they had come in their understanding of their captors. The pie, once a bewildering experience, had become part of a larger narrative of transformation. As they tasted the sweetness of the apples and the buttery crust, it was not just the food they were savoring. It was the realization that their perceptions of good and evil, right and wrong, were no longer so easily defined. The contradictions that had begun with a simple piece of pie now permeated every aspect of their lives in the camp. And yet, despite the growing sense of empathy and understanding, the women could not escape the larger reality of their situation. They were still prisoners. They were still at the mercy of their captors, still uncertain of what the future held. And though small moments of kindness had begun to reshape their understanding of the world, the war was far from over. They could not forget the horrors of the past, nor the reasons they had been captured in the first place. The contradictions they faced were not just personal. They were moral, ideological, and deeply entwined with the fabric of the war itself. Could a small act of kindness truly change everything? Could the taste of apple pie and the unexpected empathy it symbolized be enough to challenge everything they had been taught about their enemies? As the days passed, the women of the POW camp found themselves at a crossroads, torn between the ideals they had once held and the humanity they were now beginning to recognize in the very people they had been taught to hate. The time spent in the POW camp had transformed the women in ways they could not have imagined. What had begun as a stark and disorienting experience, full of fear and mistrust, had evolved into something far more complex. The lines between enemy and ally, victim and oppressor, had blurred to the point where the world they had once known seemed almost irrelevant. The transformation was not instantaneous. It was gradual, shaped by small but profound shifts in perception. Each act of kindness, each moment of unexpected humanity, had chipped away at the rigid walls that separated the captors from the prisoners. But the true climax of their transformation came not from an act of food or compassion, but from an event that shook them to their core. The end of the war was drawing nearer. The defeat of Japan was becoming inevitable. The POWs had heard rumors, whispers among the guards, that the war was coming to an end. Some of the women felt a surge of hope, while others could not yet bring themselves to believe it. Yet, as the war's conclusion became more certain, the reality of what lay ahead began to settle in. Their fate, it seemed, was about to change, one way or another. The moment of ultimate transformation came with the news of Japan's surrender. The prisoners of war, who had been stripped of everything they once knew, were now faced with the possibility of being repatriated, of returning to a broken nation. The emotional upheaval was profound. Many of the women had lost their families, their homes, and their identity as citizens of a proud empire. To return to Japan now, after all that had transpired, was a bitter prospect. And yet, they knew that it was their only hope for survival. The American soldiers, having heard of the surrender, acted with surprising compassion. They began to treat the women not as enemies, but as human beings caught in the tragic aftermath of a war that had consumed them all. The guards who had once been distant and stern now showed a level of warmth and understanding. They spoke of their own hopes for the future, of returning home to their families, of rebuilding lives torn apart by the war. The women, too, began to speak of what lay ahead. Some were eager to return home, while others were consumed by a deep sense of loss. The question of what had been sacrificed, what had been irrevocably lost, lingered in their minds. But there was one more powerful gesture that cemented the transformation. The guards, who had once been the source of the women's fear, now offered them one final act of humanity, an opportunity to send letters home. The women, many of whom had not heard from their families in years, were overcome with emotion. The guards, once seen as heartless oppressors, had now become facilitators of connection and healing. They were not just enemies. They were people too, capable of understanding, capable of kindness. For the first time in their captivity, the women had the opportunity to communicate with the outside world, to reconnect with their loved ones, to offer a glimmer of hope in the midst of all they had endured. These letters became more than just words on paper. They were symbols of survival, of resilience, and of the human capacity to heal even in the most unimaginable circumstances. The women wrote to their families with a mix of sorrow and hope, telling them of the horrors they had witnessed and the small moments of kindness they had experienced. As the news of Japan's surrender spread, the women were released from captivity. They were repatriated, returned to their homeland, but the world they returned to was nothing like the one they had left. Japan was broken, its cities in ruins, its people facing an uncertain future. The transformation that had begun with a simple slice of apple pie had taken them on a journey of self-reflection and personal growth. They had entered the camp as prisoners, enemies of the United States, but they left as something more complex, survivors of a war that had tested their strength, their beliefs, and their humanity. For many of the women, the journey of reintegration into post-war Japan was fraught with challenges. The country was grappling with its defeat, and the women who returned from captivity were often viewed with suspicion. They had been prisoners, and in some eyes, that meant they had failed. Yet the transformation they had undergone was not something that could be easily dismissed. They had been forced to confront their deepest fears, to question their loyalty to a dying empire, and to reconcile their beliefs with the reality of their captivity. In the end, they emerged from the war as women forever changed, changed by the kindness of their captors, by the sweetness of apple pie, and by the recognition that the boundaries between enemy and friend were not as clear as they had once believed. The transformation did not end with their return home. It carried with them a quiet but powerful force that influenced their lives long after the war had ended. They spoke of their experiences, of the moments of humanity that had redefined their understanding of war and peace. Their stories became part of a larger narrative of healing, of reconciliation, and of the enduring power of compassion in the face of adversity. In the years that followed, these women would reflect on the simple act of kindness that had changed everything. They would remember the taste of apple pie, not just as a reminder of their captivity, but as a symbol of the transformation that had taken place within them. It was a symbol of the power of humanity to transcend even the most brutal of conflicts, to find light in the darkest of times. The impact of this experience would reverberate throughout their lives. They would never forget the simple sweetness of that first bite, nor the profound lesson it taught them that even in the most unlikely places, humanity could be found. The end of the war brought liberation, but for the women who had been prisoners, liberation was not a simple return to normalcy. It was an emotional and psychological journey that took them far beyond the borders of the POW camps and back into a world forever changed. The war had stripped them of their homes, their families, and their identities, but the kindness they had received in captivity, most poignantly represented by the taste of that apple pie, remained etched in their memories, marking the beginning of their transformation. When they returned to Japan, they faced a country in ruins, torn apart by the devastation of war. The women, now survivors, grappled with the loss of their former lives and struggled to rebuild, both personally and as a nation. But they also carried with them a new perspective, one that transcended borders, ideologies, and the years of hatred that had defined the conflict. The women's journey from enemies to human beings in the eyes of their captors symbolized the possibility of reconciliation, even in the most hostile and divided of times. The apple pie, though just a simple dessert, became a metaphor for the lessons learned in captivity, that humanity could survive even the most brutal conflicts, that kindness could emerge from the unlikeliest of places, and that forgiveness and understanding had the power to heal. In the years that followed, many of the women would reflect on this lesson, sharing their stories with younger generations as a reminder of the power of compassion in a world often consumed by violence. The taste of apple pie, unexpectedly sweet amidst the bitterness of war, remained with them as a symbol of hope, of a world where humanity could triumph over division. The question remains, can we, in times of conflict, find the same capacity for kindness and understanding in the unlikeliest places?